You know, I often joke about all the things that Riot is afraid of, like story-based games, Skarner getting a skin, cigars. But time and time again, there is one thing that just keeps coming back. It is the same thing that is the bane of Riot's existence, and that of course is diehard champion mains. Look, these people are responsible for countless threats, many different boycotts, and many civil wars that were waged over skins. But this time it is different. Because a single Morgana main actually achieved the impossible. They managed to put the slightest scratch onto Riot's legal side. You see, while these news have been spreading around for about 3 days now, the entire story started at the beginning of the Spirit Blossom season. Specifically, it began with the exalted skin for Morgana. Now, I'll be honest, by now I thought that people got used to the fact that exalted skins are pretty much legendary skins with a bit of extra sparkle. Sometimes they can be ultimate quality, but sometimes not. And that is the key point of today's matter. It seems like exalted skins don't really have a clear standard. And that's because they all focus on different features. The Jinx skin stood out with the 3 different personalities. After Mordekaiser's skin got fixed, he stood out with the 3 forms that also changed the ultimate. But now we got Morgana's exalted skin, which does only have 2 forms, but that's partially because its visual focus is elsewhere. She does have a cinematic spawning animation, and she does have a toggle that changes the visuals of her abilities. Or at least it changes the mask in her Q and in her ultimate. So overall, I wouldn't say that this skin is that horrible, at least compared to the other exalted skins. Though maybe that's just saying something about exalted skins. But I can tell you for certain that there were a lot of people who didn't like the skin's features. And they were quite mad about it. Can you blame them? I don't think so, since we are still talking about a skin that has the average price of $250. And so some kind of a standard should be present. And about a month ago, on Reddit, on the Morgana mains subreddit, the user LoveForNuva decided to change that. And so they posted this. To sum it up so we don't have to read the entire thing, in the first part they talk about how a lot of people gave Riot feedback about the missing features, and how the quality of this skin is below what we got previously. Now I would argue that the skin is comparable, but that's only because every exalted skin so far had some kind of an issue. Morgana just ended up missing the most obvious part that is the most visible. Just imagine if the mask toggle actually swapped the entire visual effect for the spells. Then I don't think this skin would have that much of an issue. But then you could run into the issue of Morgana being able to just visually swap out her spells in the middle of the game, which opens up a whole new gameplay clarity rabbit hole, where Lux was able to get around this by swapping her spells only twice a game, and even that skin is a lot cheaper than this. Anyway, in the next part they mentioned that Riot is operating in the EU, and therefore they have to follow the EU consumer protection. And so they wrote this. Let's see what the authorities think. Long story short, yes, I actually wrote an official email to the European Commission briefly outlining the situation, and asking for their view on whether Riot's handling of this release is in line with the current consumer rights and digital product standards. Now, as smug as this may sound when written like this, immediately after this they also wrote that they are not filing this with any kind of malicious intent. This is not a Morgana main who is full of hate, who wants to see Riot burn. I know, kinda unbelievable. No, this is a person who just wants to see Riot held up to a standard. And I say that is admirable. And so they shared a letter they sent to the European Commission. Here, forgive the formatting because the website is quite awful, but they did go straight to the point. They explain how Riot is selling skins in League of Legends, and how there is an exalted tier that is very expensive, but also how there is no way to know the quality of the skin before purchase, because the quality simply varies too much. To be fair, that is a very valid reason to call for consumer protection. Then they go specifically into all the features that the skin is possibly missing, such as the lack of forms compared to the other skins, not enough distinction between the forms, missing voice lines, missing animations, the mask toggle doesn't do that much. And what's important to mention here is that all of these are valid points, since Riot is still selling a product where the assumption is that these skins are gonna have these features. Not to mention, there is no way to know what the skin actually looks like in the game. You literally have to jump onto a third-party website to see what you're buying. And so at the end of the letter they talk about transparency and consistency issues on Riot's part, with the added bonus being the fact that players actually complained about this and Riot didn't act. Now after all of this was posted, you may notice that the original post had about 155 upvotes on Reddit, which is not that much to your average Morgana Joe that is just passing by. It may have been seen as just another post of someone who didn't like the exalted skin, and so they were going wild about threatening and lawsuits. But who's laughing now? That's right, a month later we got an update. So after the letter reached the European Commission, Europe replied back. Based on our understanding of your email, you acquired the digital content, the skin, directly from the developer Riot Games, rather than through an online intermediary such as an online marketplace. In such cases, the Digital Service Act does not apply. In other words, yes, the quality of the exalted skin may be bad, but technically it is just Riot making a skin and naming their own price. They aren't breaking any laws. But then the reply continues. However, as you have pointed out, the behavior you described may give rise to potential claims under warranty and consumer protection laws, such as the Digital Content Directive. With this directive, the EU has harmonized a high level of consumer protection across the EU for the supply of digital content and digital service. To translate this part, in theory, digital goods also have to have some kind of warranty. So if the skin is simply not good enough, something could be enforced here. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but in cases like these, Riot is not gonna get fined or anything like that. Rather than that, they might be forced into offering a refund. However, exalted skins are part of the gacha gambling, and the gacha has strict no refunds policy. In fact, Riot is quite clever with how they handle the refund policy. The official post mentions that Hextech crafting is not refundable, but it doesn't mention sparks. But that's why the entire sanctum for the gacha system is not in the store, it is under loot, right next to the Hextech crafting. Let me just say, that is devilishly clever. Anyway, I don't think anything can be enforced here, even if Europe could. And that's the thing. The reply has one more part. The European Commission does not have any enforcement powers in this regard, which instead lie in the competent authorities of the respected member states. And so while Europe can't enforce anything, people can complain to a specific country's department, and they would be able to do something about it. And in this case, since this user is from Austria, that's where they got linked. And so they went to the Austrian website and they filed for the same complaint. At which point I would like to mention that this is quite the effort since we are talking about a skin. And in fact, a month later, Austria replied too. And thankfully, since their native language is German, we got the translated version. Here, Austria mentioned that their consumer center is linked with 30 other countries across Europe, meaning that if something is enforced, the countries cooperate on it. And since Riot Games itself is operating from Ireland, which is in Europe, something can be done about it. In fact, we got presented with 3 options. The first option would be the consumer center directly forwarding this to Ireland, where they could try and force Riot to lower the price to meet the standards. Yes, things are getting scary. As they mentioned, there is the possibility here that something could happen because of the warranty law. But again, remember that in return, Riot could just offer some kind of a refund for European players. Not to mention that we are talking about a skin that was on a banner, and so even if they lower the price now, you can't buy it anymore. And so, option 2 would be evoking the competition law, and have Austria try and directly sue them. But here they mentioned that there is no guarantee that the law department would actually pursue this. I'll be honest, I have no idea in what way they can twist a competition law to be in the favor of the players. And so option 3, which, spoiler alert, this is the option they went for, is simply raising Riot's potential infringement to Austria, who could then directly forward this to the Ireland branch. But since this is actually just a complaint, they would need to get a pile of complaints to know that this is an issue that is worth looking into. They even say, if you are able to find other consumers within the gaming community with similar issues, this approach could be considered. And so, as I mentioned, the Morgana main asked for a third option, and specifically they asked about how many complaints they should gather. And so, I wouldn't be surprised if in the near future there was a petition floating around. Because as of right now, we are waiting for the Austrian protection to reply. But this is quite an interesting case, because if there is a petition with enough signatures, Europe could try and legally enforce quality control onto Riot games. But the chances of this actually happening are insanely low. Because once this rabbit hole is opened, then suddenly we are dealing with legality. And once something happens in the law, it can be used to enforce the same thing across all the other companies. Which is why nobody ever touches any of these legal issues. Nobody ever pursues it because nobody wants to apply that across the entire market. In fact, the only time this has ever happened in gaming history, where people complained and as a result something happened, it was with loot boxes, where some countries in Europe straight up made them illegal. And look at us now! With gacha still being in most of our games.